Hello, we ready? We go? Hello, Gabriel.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
I'm fine, and I'd like to ask you about fiscal policy. Why don't we start with the way in which fiscal policy has evolved in Russia and with the fiscal policy rules? Could you explain?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that in terms of how fiscal policy evolved in Russia, it's very clear that since the early 2000s, the authorities understood very well that volatility in energy markets presented a very important challenge for them. So what the authorities began thinking was, all right, at the beginning, let's try to set up a kind of a buffer that would allow us to save some of the oil windfall when prices are high, and then successively began to think about rules that would target a specific benchmark price that they thought it was more stable than the market oil price. Right now, there is a big debate in Russia about what to do with the funds that are being accumulated in the National Welfare Fund. That is this big buffer that the government has associated with the fiscal rule. So I think that there is a question of patience here. I mean, the buffers in the case of Russia, the fiscal buffers in the case of Russia are still relatively small. I mean, they are going to reach around 7% of GDP. Later this year, they're going to be, close to 2 digits by mid next year. I think that there is this trade-off because between waiting and actually spending the sustainable part or just basically using your assets. And I think this is the debate that is ongoing. Right now it's a difficult one.
So Russia is not the first to do this or the only country to do this. Could you talk a little bit about other examples, and because I think they've learned from others as
Absolutely.
well?
It's a great question, actually. Interestingly enough, when you look at fiscal rules, in particular fiscal rules in the context of strong commodity exporters, there are many examples, but I think that in the case of Chile and in the case of Norway, Russia has a very good mirror to watch itself. I think that the real best practice is what Norway is doing. What Norway is doing is that the money that is accumulated in this buffer is completely invested in assets outside the country. Why this is important? This is important because if these assets were invested inside the country, then automatically the link between oil prices and fiscal policy is restored, not through expenditures in the budget, but by asset allocation of the National Welfare Fund. The Norwegians understood this very well. At the same time, it is not completely possible to link both of them because, of course, if you accumulate assets and these assets are well invested, sooner or later you are going to obtain a return, and this return can come back to the budget in the form of revenues to finance expenditures. The good thing about this is that this return is much more sustainable. By definition, the natural resources that Russia is obtaining revenues from are resources that are non-renewable. In a way, there is this asset below ground that is turned into a revenue, but really this asset is limited. And so investing these assets outside provides two good benefits. The first benefit is that the economy is much less vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices, and so the linking oil prices from fiscal policy is preserved. But the second thing is that by obtaining a return of these assets, what de facto is occurring is that these assets are there for the current generation of Russians, but also for all the future generations of Russians that are not lucky enough to be in a time in which there's still oil below the ground. So I think this is the debate right now. And the debate is so important because, as I said, it can have multiple consequences if in the end Russians decide to do otherwise, not the Norwegian way.
So is this the sort of thing that you would counsel countries that are resource intensive exporters to design?
Absolutely,
generally?
yes. Absolutely, yes. This is clearly best practice. Of course, there is very difficult to calibrate exactly, how much of the returns of the fund will have to go back to the budget. The Norwegians themselves are having a problem because at the beginning they thought, when they designed this fiscal rule, that if they extracted the given return, that I think was 3% of the return at the beginning, it would be sustainable and would be consistent with having more or less a stable real exchange rate. And what they have experienced is that they have been very successful in obtaining a very large return of this fund, and they are getting an appreciation of the real exchange even from spending the return of the fund.
So you just, as you say, having a fiscal rule helps you with the monetary policy. Yeah. How do you feel that helps? Why is that such a big part of a successful monetary policy framework?
I think I would say it's not part of the monetary policy framework, but rather is part of a composite of macroeconomic policies. And so the fact that the fiscal rule very nicely delinks oil prices from changes in expenditures, fiscal expenditures, means that fluctuations in demand, and so fluctuations in economic activity, fluctuations in prices, are much smoother, are less extreme than if there was no fiscal rule. Of course, this means that the economic cycle is smoother. It means that inflation changes are smoother. It means that, more importantly, it means that fluctuations in the real exchange rate are less acute or less severe. And this, of course, in a country like Russia, where around 40% of the consumer price index is food, and where around 2/3 of the consumer price index is dominated by tradable goods, having less fluctuations in the real exchange rate because of the fiscal rule makes the task of the central bank much easier. Of course, the central bank has other problems, because not only fluctuations in the oil price or fluctuations in current account of the balance of payments influence the real exchange rate, and fluctuations in there is a financial account and of the balance of payments is another issue, but at least the fact that they have a well-functioning fiscal rule, has simplified enormously the task of the central bank.
So to shift a little bit, in sort of textbook economics, when you first learn about fiscal policy, regardless of whether it's a open or close, a small economy, a big economy, an open economy, a closed economy, the first thing somebody tells you is that fiscal policy should be balanced over sort of cycles. So it should stabilize, but you run deficits during recessions, you run surpluses during booms, and you pay them off. Do you think that sounds a lot like what you're talking about? Can we transfer some of these lessons to advanced economies that are more diversified, that seem to have trouble running their fiscal policy in the way that the textbook says they should?
This is an excellent question. I think that yes. Of course, there is an element that makes them more important in commodity-rich countries, because there is an element of the revenues in the federal government that depend on the reserves, on revenues that are inherently unstable. So if you go to a more advanced economy or a country that is not resource-rich, I think that the basic lesson is kept. As you said, the advice should be, there is automatic stabilization that is provided usually on the revenue side, because profit taxes on profits, taxes on income fluctuate with the cycle, and at the same time on the expenditure side you have things like unemployment benefits that also fluctuate with the cycle. So the idea would be, let those automatic stabilizers work, and so basically the fiscal policy would run against the wind in opportunities where the economy is in recession, increasing deficits, and when the economy is expanding, increasing surpluses. And in addition to that, this would build some space for you to do some structural policy, creates fiscal space to do some structural policy, additional structural policy, in terms of maybe increasing your structural deficit during bad times. I think this is a lesson that, as you said, is a very basic lesson when you study economics, and it can be very useful for countries at all levels of income. So, as a matter of fact, this is the type of discussion that we have with our more advanced economy members. So yes, the answer is yes.
There's a little bit of discussion about trying to improve automatic stabilizers. One of the things about the fiscal rule for Russia and for Chile and for Norway is that it's automatic.
Actually, let me clarify something about the fiscal rule in Russia, because as a matter of fact, there is still a difference between, and there is something that it can be, if you want, improved gradually in Russia. In the case of Russia, the fiscal rule only targets the oil revenue. Actually, it is not a fiscal rule that takes into consideration the non-revenue part. Why? Because it's very difficult to calculate the output gap in an economy where the oil sector is around 20% of GDP. It requires calculating the output gap for the non-oil sector and calculating structural non-oil revenues. And this is something that it requires having an institution that is going to be the official institution that is going to be in charge of calculating the output gaps in the non-oil sector. And so it has some challenges involved. So what we are seeing in Russia is that so far, since a very large part of fluctuations are associated with oil prices, just targeting this part has been enough.
Is there a way to improve the automatic part of the stabilizers that you've thought of for the advanced economies, for the more of the high-income economies?
I think that the stabilization is important from the revenue side is when you have a balance of taxes that are more linked with those aggregates that are more cyclical, if you want. So what's clearly cyclical? Revenues are, incomes are cyclical, profits are cyclical. Consumption has some cyclicality, but it's more resilient. So if you want to improve the functioning of automatic stabilizers, create, if you want, a stronger response that is just automatically built, you need to resort to those taxes that are more cyclical. The profit tax, corporate profit tax, income tax.
And on the revenue and on the expenditure side, that's a focus of the revenue?
I think on the expenditure side, building a good system of transfers, of unemployment transfers is essential. It's very difficult because it can be costly. It can create, in some cases, incentives that prevent people from reinserting themselves in the labor market. So it has to be very well thought because you want people to actually wait, but not wait too much. So I think that good unemployment benefits that balance these issues also can significantly improve fiscal policy through the cycle.
Oh, well, that's great. I think that's a fine ending point. And Gabriel, who would you like to speak to next?
I think that all these issues that we're talking about, interaction between fiscal and monetary policy, there is a person that I would really discuss these issues with, and is Director of Monetary Policy of Central Bank of Russia, Alexei Savotkin.